What is up, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Parties, the show where we talk about fun little things like politics, but try to do so in a way that avoids the political rhetoric and tries to stick to a more intellectual and fact-based approach of just having a genuine discussion on these topics. Right now, politics is all sorts of supercharged, and you can see that kind of just with like everything. You can see that with like the last election, especially where both parties were really talking about the how dangerous it would be if the other party won, and this kind of mentality of, oh well, if the Republicans win, it could destroy democracy. Like you saw terms like, oh, we are fighting for the soul of the nation, or we are fighting for democracy itself. Whereas the Republicans made the same arguments about the Democrats, talking about how they are dangerous and they want to destroy the country. And it's rhetoric, which, first of all, when you really think about it, it's like, why do we discuss both parties and the federal government as a whole in such a way where it's like, okay, if the wrong party gets in charge, it could destroy the country. It could ruin democracy. It could completely destroy the nation. But then it also just really begs the question as to why are we at the point where this is how we even talk about the two parties? Like, why do we even think that, either party is so powerful and so destructive that they will destroy the country? And really, it comes down to what, in my opinion, is essentially the war between the two parties. It's the war between the Republicans and the Democrats, and it really is a war. And part of that stems initially from the nature of, a political party in general. A political party is essentially just organized politics. It's like-minded people who are getting together in an organized manner in order to be able to win elections, in order to affect policy change. Like, that is the sole purpose of the political party, is to help people with certain policy ideas get power in order to enact those ideas. So right off the bat, you already see how the nature of these political parties is to win. And in a lot of cases, they will do what they need to in order to win, because that is their sole function. That's why we have laws in place to sort of regulate conduct, because if it's left unchecked, they will kind of just do whatever they want. And, in a lot of cases, that's the nature of human beings in general, is, these laws are in place because if they weren't, you probably would have a lot of rampant bad things happening. Like, that is the whole reason we have law. So when it comes to political parties, it's very similar. Like, they want to win elections. They want to gain power. They want to be able to enact the changes that they feel are what needs to happen for the country. And so when you have a two-party system, it makes it in a lot of ways a lot easier for each party, which I would argue is why both major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, have worked very hard to maintain the two-party system as is. Because if you have only one other party you have to worry about, winning those elections becomes a lot easier, because all you have to do is convince people to vote for your party and not the other party. And a big way that, that can be done, and what I think you are seeing a lot now, is the easiest way to convince people to vote for your party and give your party all the control isn't necessarily just to convince them that your party is the best party. It's to convince them that the other party is a horrible party, is a destructive party, or an evil party, that their goal is to destroy the country, that they don't agree with your values, that they hate your values even, that they want to eliminate everything that you believe in. And so it's incredibly vital that you do not let that party get in charge. And I feel like that's something that you've seen for a good chunk of our nation's history. There's definitely been periods where we've had, a lot more peace between the parties. Things weren't necessarily as chaotic. Things weren't necessarily as triggering or as aggressive. But especially in the last few decades, you're seeing more and more an increase in each party's need to present the opposite party as being just about the worst thing that could possibly happen to the country. And during the last election, you saw this a lot. You saw the Republicans really going after the Democrats, not just as, people who they disagreed with, but as literally an evil that hates America and wants to destroy everything it stands for. Going so far as to even some Republicans were making claims that Democrats were actively working with foreign enemies to destroy the country. On the flip side, you saw Democrats making the very, very same arguments that Republicans, maybe not so much back then, but definitely now are, they are bad. They are fighting to strip away your rights. They are fighting to dismantle checks and balances. They are fighting to destroy the country. Now, regardless of what you personally believe and how you feel about current or former people in office or what they've done, the fact of the matter is this has been the rhetoric for both parties for a while. This kind of mentality that it's not just that my party, has these ideas and policies that we feel would be best for the country. It's that, your party, that party, is the exact opposite of everything America should stand for. Like, it will cause harm rather than good. And it is better for, this party to get elected so that party doesn't cause that harm. So when you have that sort of situation, you're going to create a bigger and bigger divide. You're going to create the sort of system where each party is going more and more to the extreme, because that is where people tend to gravitate towards, are extremes when they feel that that might be the only option to save the nation. I would very much argue that Donald Trump and a lot of his rhetoric is more of a symptom than like the actual cause, because people are gravitating to the extremes because their party has been presenting the Democratic Party as essentially the devil incarnate. Like, the Democratic Party will destroy the country. Whereas Democrats have presented the exact same mentality. Maybe not necessarily as strongly in all regards, but they definitely have been making the case that the Republican Party is going to cause way more harm than good, even outside of Trump. There definitely seems to be a mentality among some that, this is very recent, but it really isn't. Both parties have been presenting the other party as like the absolute like bad for the country for a very long time. But moving past this branch of the discussion, what you're seeing with the two parties is, since they are so determined to need to win, they are utilizing whatever tools they can to win. Like, their goal is to take control of the government. And I think that's where we're seeing the greatest danger to our country, is the erosion of checks and balances and the erosion of the separation of power, being replaced by, each party trying to gain as much control of the entire government as they possibly can. So to give an example of what I mean by that, the Supreme Court is definitely supposed to be a neutral body. It is supposed to be, middle of the road, not liberal, not conservative. It's supposed to abide by the text of the law. Now, there's plenty of cases where that has certainly happened. But one thing that you're seeing, for instance, in a lot of rhetoric during elections is, we better, be careful who you're voting for, because there's a good chance that the president is going to be able to make a nominee for the Supreme Court, or 2 nominees for the Supreme Court. Like, that is an actual, aspect of the debate is, you better be careful, because if you vote for a Republican candidate for office, he's going to get to choose, potentially who the next Supreme Court is, member is, which means that, it's very, very clear at this point, at least I would argue, that the presidents tend to pick people who ideologically side with them and who are willing to, vote on their cases based on that ideology. You'll look at Supreme Court cases and you will definitely see a lot of, decisions being based along party lines, where you'll have, the conservative judges all sided this way in the case, whereas the liberal judges all sided this way. And that is literal discussion that you'll see even in the media is, these justices will typically vote this way on conservative issues and this way on liberal issues, and, so on. And it really goes to show how partisan the Supreme Court is. And that is dangerous, because the Supreme Court, whether you agree that they should have this authority or not, more or less gets to define what the Constitution says, what the law says. So if you have a partisan body who has so much power that they can literally define what the law says, that can be very dangerous, because it means that you have a political party that can control what exactly the Constitution actually means, even if their interpretation seems wildly different than what you would think the interpretation of certain texts within the Constitution would mean. But the Supreme Court is being used very much as a tool by the political parties to, again, maintain their party control over the government. And this isn't just Republicans, it's definitely Democrats as well. I brought up the, Republicans earlier because President Trump is in charge right now, but this is definitely something that, Biden, President Obama, Democratic presidents have certainly utilized, Supreme Court justices in their war against the other party as well, going as far back as FDR, who tried to get a law passed to put a retirement age in order to knock out justices that weren't going to support his policy, so he could essentially stack the court with justices who would, in fact, agree with what he wanted to do. So you are seeing this sort of battle between the two parties is certainly starting to erode, and I say starting, it's been eroding checks and balances and separation of powers for a while, because you have battles to control every aspect of government, including the Supreme Court, and you have the Supreme Court making decisions which are having long-term effects. A recent Supreme Court decision ruled that the president, in a lot of cases, when he is acting in quote-unquote an official capacity, has immunity under the law, which is definitely being celebrated by Republicans. I don't know how much it'll be celebrated by them when you have a Democratic president in charge utilizing the same power. But the truth of the matter is, even though conservatives really push for that, Democratic presidents are going to have that same authority as well. And that's the way political power works, is once you give the government that power, you may agree with what they are doing with it at the time, but, the minute a party is elected that you disagree with, they also will utilize that same authority, which is a big reason why each party is fighting so hard to maintain long-lasting control over the government. And you see that fight going on all the time. it's pretty rare to see political discourse nowadays where people aren't mentioning, like, either how good or how bad one party is over the other. Usually how bad one party is. They don't even need to necessarily praise their own party as long as they're bashing the other one. And it's by design, because ultimately the easiest way for each party to win their elections isn't even to convince you that they're the best for the country, is to convince you that the other party is the worst possible thing that could happen to this country. And ultimately, that just pushes each party further and further apart. It creates a bigger divide, and it creates more fear and more anger among the public, because they're convinced that it has to be a constant fight to keep their party in power, because the minute the other party is in power, they could literally undo everything and destroy the country. Now, that hasn't really happened. We still have our Constitution. We still do have plenty of checks and balances. We still do have limitations on what the government can do to your personal life. You're still very, very free in this country. But they still utilize the fear and the anger to convince you as the public to keep voting them in office. And they do that because it gets them, public support. They get the votes and the people are putting them in charge. And that's how most tyrannies are formed. That's how most erosions of checks and balances and the law itself happen. It's very rare that someone just comes in and, is able to force control and take over. It's very usually they utilize the system in place in order to gain more power and in order to garner public support. Doesn't even have to be everybody in the country, but just good, enough public support that them being in power is completely legitimate. A good example that I always love is Star Wars. I know a lot of people hate the prequels. I'm one of those weird ones that absolutely love the prequels. I think they're really fun movies. But, throughout the entire prequels, you see this in action. You have Palpatine, who runs for office, and he is elected. And then as different crises happen, he convinces the Senate to vote him more and more power. Like, he uses the system to get more power, to be able to stay in office longer than he should have, to be able to wield more power than he was supposed to. And all of it is, of course, under the pretense that, once the crisis of the Clone Wars is over, he's going to give it all back. But once you give political power, it can be very hard to take it away, as is found out. But he gets public support. Like, the people love him, and the Senate cheers him on. And he doesn't wrestle control, like, he's given control. And then by the time you get towards the end of the third movie, where he is able to use a crisis in order to declare that he is reforming the Republic into an empire for the safety and security of the galaxy, he isn't jeered or booed. There's no one who stands up to him, really. Like, the entire Senate chamber just erupts into cheers. And one of my favorite quotes in the entire movie is when it pans over to Padme, and she just gets that look on her face, and she says, "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." And it resonates because that's usually how liberty does die, because the people cheer them on, because they support what the government is doing. If the government is overstepping its bounds, they will cheer, people will cheer it on as long as they agree with what is being done. And I feel like you've seen this throughout the history of the country. It's very relevant, I think, nowadays, but certainly one party is not solely responsible. This has been something that both parties have been doing, where they will test the boundaries, they will act outside, of the Constitution and see if they're called out. And if they're not, it kind of establishes that they are allowed to do that. It's really easy to point to some of the things going on now with President Trump and his executive orders meant to kind of bypass Congress to do what he wants. But Trump is not the first president to do that. You can even point directly to President Obama, who, when he was getting frustrated when Congress wasn't acting in the way when he felt Congress wasn't passing laws they should, pretty famously said that if Congress wasn't going to act, he had a phone and he had a pen and he would act himself, essentially saying that he would enact executive orders to bypass Congress and do it himself. Now, you could totally agree or disagree with, what President Obama was trying to do or what President Trump is trying to do. But the truth of the matter is, regardless of whether you agree with what they're doing or not, if they are violating the law and the Constitution and bypassing the checks and balances in order to get it done, that is an authority that, they're using. But then the next time someone comes in who doesn't belong to your political party, they will have the exact same authority to do that. And usually once they, it's like you give an inch, they take a mile. You give them a little bit of leeway in that regard, and they will take more and more and keep pushing it to see how far they can in order to exercise more control. Because again, that is the nature of a political party. That is the nature of government in general. And that's why you have a constitution and law in place, and the concept that no one person is above the law, that no group is above the law, that the law applies to everybody equally, regardless of who you are. So political parties are certainly utilizing that in their war against each other, and relying on public support, to cheer them on, because if they don't have public support for what they're doing, then they're going to have to stick much more strictly to the Constitution. But they are getting away with overstepping their bounds. And it's not just one party. Both parties have been guilty of this, and sort of building more and more power that each party gets. It just kind of keeps increasing and increasing, because, you'll have Democrats in power who do this, and then you'll have Republicans who are elected next, and they will continue to do this. And oftentimes each party will use, they'll point fingers and be like, well, I'm doing this, you guys are complaining, but you were perfectly happy when the Republicans were doing it, and, vice versa. And what you're seeing is that this war between political parties, the casualty is liberty. What is ultimately going to be the end result in this battle is the complete erosion of the checks and balances and separation of powers, and, in order to allow one of these political parties more or less absolute control, because that is ultimately what they fight for. Each party argues for liberty, but when you're expanding government authority in order to, force your policies through, and when you're ignoring checks and balances, sure, maybe it's going to increase liberty for people with what you're doing, but you're also opening the floodgates for, if someone gets elected who doesn't have that liberty, or who doesn't support that liberty, you've given them a lot of power. When you go back to Aristotle in his Politics, he actually argued that in a perfect world, a monarchy would be the best form of government. Because in a monarchy, you have one person who has complete control over everything. One person making the decisions. They can make quick decisions. Everything can be consistent. Ultimately, the government just will run much more efficiently that way. But when it comes to monarchy, the problem is you could have the absolute best king, who's benevolent, who's kind, who's intelligent, who creates a bunch of freedom and prosperity for all of his people. But eventually, he is going to die, and the next king may not have the same values, may not have the same beliefs. And if that's the case, he is going to still have like all this power that the prior king was wielding, and he could easily flip things around and establish like a much more severe tyranny over the people. And that is the issue with, regardless of what you personally believe and what you want to see being done by the government, if you are increasing government power, regardless of what party you belong to, maybe that's going to make it easier for your party to get done what they want and, to see the policies you feel need to be done for the betterment of our country. But when the other party inevitably gets elected, they're going to have the exact same power. Like, political power doesn't work only on one political party and that's it. And both parties know that, and that's a big reason why they maintain this two-party system, because it works better for them, because power is still being increased, and it's a lot easier to get elected when you can turn the other party into the enemy, as opposed to having to battle a bunch of different enemies. Now, when it comes to political parties, there's a very real chance we may never be able to get out of the two-party system as a whole. America has always had a two-party system going all the way back to the beginning of the country, where you had Adams and Jefferson's parties, which were very different. They were basically debating how much control the federal government should have versus the states. So maybe they aren't that different, because that's definitely a discussion going on now, is how much control should the states have and how much control should the federal government have in order to force the states, to maintain certain standards. So I guess in a lot of ways it is very much the same battle that we've always been fighting. But these two parties are always going to be fighting each other. And maybe we will be able to move away from a two-party system, maybe not. Regardless, we need to figure out how to fix our system to better limit what the two parties themselves can actually do. Because this war with the two parties is ultimately, it's just going to result in the crumbling of our country, and it's not going to be just one party's fault. It's going to be the responsibility of both parties that over the past several decades have increasingly fought to erode, checks and balances. And this is, this goes so far, like going back to the Supreme Court, you even had FDR trying to stack the Supreme Court by pushing for a law to... Now, you could believe that one party is inherently worse than the other. You could believe that one party has done more harm than the other. And I'm not here to, at least in this specific episode, I'm not trying to argue one way or the other, like which has caused more damage, which have eroded more. My point is that both parties have worked to increase federal authority in part of their war against each other, and they've utilized public support in letting them do that. Like they are perfectly fine with the people cheering them on, because if the people are in charge, or at the very least their own constituents who belong to their party, they feel like they are in the right and that they are doing the right thing. And that, to me, is what is dangerous, is this constant battle between the two parties, which is resulting in the public itself supporting the erosion of the Constitution, the erosion of checks and balances, because to them, like, as long as we're beating the other party, we're winning. And that's what's important, regardless of what we lose in the process. And that's what we need to be standing against as a country, is this sort of mentality that, as long as we're increasing government authority to get done the right things, it's automatically going to be a win. Now, that doesn't mean, there isn't a debate to be had about, where the lines are and, what genuinely like good action should be taken, and are there any times where action should be taken, and then ask forgiveness rather than permission. But when you have this sort of mentality that as long as what my party is doing is enacting the policies I believe in, then they should be allowed to just do it. That's where you're going to end up with the complete dismantling of the system that we have in order to limit the government. And it's all just one big war between both parties to try to, maintain power. And they are doing that by fighting very hard to maintain absolute control over all branches of government. And you see this, especially in this current administration, where they keep talking about a mandate. They keep talking about how the people voted in a Republican Congress, they voted in a Republican president, and they have a conservative majority in the Supreme Court, which that in and of itself, the fact that the Supreme Court is being included as part of a mandate in trying to win control, which again, both parties have been fighting very hard to win control of the Supreme Court. But, when you have all three branches controlled by the same political party who have the same agenda, including being able to interpret the law however they really wish without that much of a check on that authority or being able to stop that, it really is hard to stop the government from kind of just doing what it wants. Thankfully, we do have a system where there are more checks in place, for instance, the states. But it becomes a lot harder when one specific party wins everything, because then it erodes what was one of the biggest checks on the government and its power, which is the fact that it was kind of in a lot of ways supposed to be fighting itself. You have the separation of powers, and you have the different branches of government having checks on each other, specifically so they would battle each other and slow down their attempts at trying to get more control, because governments will always try to get more control, and political parties will always try to get more control. So when you have a unified system like that, where everybody kind of agrees on the same thing, and they can, you have one political party being able to make the laws, one political party able to enforce the laws, and one political party being able to interpret laws that were written ages ago, including the Constitution, pretty much however they want, including being able to do things like overturn past decisions that have been established as established interpretations of the Constitution for decades. You're running into an issue where, how exactly do you stop them? How do you slow them down? And it becomes even harder when you have, mass groups of the public cheering them on. And again, this is something that both parties have been doing. Democrats are just as happy when Democrats get complete control over the government, because that means they can also get done what they want. And again, it is absolutely fair to have discussions as to who's doing more damage, who is, which policies are actually the ones we should be supporting, and where the lines really should be. My argument here is really just that it is more important to maintain checks and balances and limited control that the government has, as opposed to trying to give them all this power in order to make sure that certain policies are pushed through. Because once they have that authority is going to be with them even when the next party is elected. And as much as some people always want to think that when their party is elected, that's it, and we've won, and you don't ever have to worry about it again, the other party will always get elected, because there's always going to be people in the middle who are unhappy with the way things are, and who are always going to vote for the other party because the current party in charge didn't fix all the problems. And believe me, those problems are going to keep getting worse and worse as long as the government and political parties remain unchecked in their authority that they can do. So that's kind of my little rant. Just talking about some thoughts I've had on this, especially lately. Kind because obviously I do a lot of research in politics, and I always think about it a lot when I'm like reading news articles and reading like people's posts and like what they feel, how they feel, and what they think about what is going on. And yeah, I really just think that we need to be careful and in a lot of ways be more consistent, because these two parties are fighting a war for control. And they have been for decades, and they will continue to be fighting this war for control. And in a lot of ways, they will use whatever means they need to in order to get that control, including weaponizing the passion of the people, weaponizing the government itself, and even in a lot of cases, weaponizing things like the Constitution in order to stay in power. So, yeah, this has been this has been an episode. I don't know if it's been a fun episode, but hopefully you guys were able to follow my thought process. If not, I apologize. These are just like a lot of things floating in my head that I just decided I'd sit down and talk about. Definitely feel free to leave any comments or have your own discussions. I'm just here presenting my personal opinion, and feel free to disagree with me. And if you think I'm wrong, do not be shy to tell me why. If you like, this sort of podcast of trying to like just discuss politics, and just trying to do it in a way where it's not all about just like, partisan rhetoric, definitely give me a support on Patreon. We would definitely appreciate that. Anything would just go to help support and grow, this podcast into something that hopefully can affect maybe like some real change, or at least get out there to a lot more people and start a national conversation about this. But that's just Patreon/Beyond the Parties, or patreon.com/Beyond the Parties. And yeah, stay tuned. I'm hoping to be publishing more consistently now, especially now that we're past the election and it's just time to like start just talking about what's going on. Although I fully intend to be in full gear come the next election. And yeah, you guys continue studying, having discussions, because ultimately that is the best thing that any democracy can have, is a well-informed citizenship that, have these conversations with each other and work together to find solutions. But have a good night, and happy, discussing your politics.